Hello, everyone, and welcome to another ACE Your Assessments podcast. And today we've got a lovely guest, Sophia Imegi, here with Eleanor, talking about how to incorporate feedback to improve your legal writing. Welcome, Sophia.
Thanks, Elena. It's nice to be on your podcast.
Thank you. Thank you so much for coming. Now, Sophia, you're a lecturer in law. You're teaching tort, land, equity, and also immigration and refugee law. Is that right?
Yes, that sounds
Good,
about
good.
right. So
Yeah,
I think I mainly get to meet students in their second year and third year. So yeah.
super. And one interesting thing about you, or something that you don't mind sharing with the students, is that you love stories, and one thing that you love more than stories is talking about stories. Very
Yeah.
cryptic.
Yeah, I think maybe that was one of the reasons why I sort of chose to do law, because I just like the act of sort of reading things, reading cases. It's a little bit like a story, although it's not always, a positive story for all the parties, but it was just something that you could read about, learn from what's happened to people, and then you get to talk about it in seminars and, write an essay about it. But to be fair, more casually, I try to be part of a book club, and then you just sort of read books and then you talk about books. So I do enjoy the sort of social aspect of not only reading books, but
Mm.
just then being able to sort of talk about it and analyze whatever you think the author was trying to say, or analyze the characters and things like that. So I do enjoy that very much. Yeah.
Thank you. That's a very nice little snippet of your life outside
Outside
DMU. That's
teaching.
brilliant. I like that. So, Sophia, just to start us off, I suppose, why do you think it's important to incorporate feedback or know how to incorporate feedback to improve our writing or our assessment writing?
Yeah, I think it's important because what is feedback? Feedback is about communicating to you the things that you've done well in terms of your writing, the areas that you've shown strength, and also getting some sort of um, pointers towards areas where you could improve on. So that's something that could actually improve your confidence or make you feel a little bit more confident with your legal writing, because now you know that, oh, I actually know how to structure my assessment properly, or I actually know how to reference properly because I've gotten feedback to say that, oh, this was very well done. And it also sort of gives you areas where you could improve on, because then you could say, oh, I'm not very strong with my analysis, or perhaps I should have referred to a little bit more cases. And now you have that, and that could sort of help you improve your marks for the next assessment. So I'd say it's very important for you to learn how to incorporate feedback, both good feedback that or things that you've done well, and then feedback regarding things or areas that you might need to work on.
I
Yeah.
like that. I like that. So,
Yeah.
what is the starting point then? Obviously, at this point, we would have received feedback on our work, hopefully either in Turnitin or
Mhm.
somewhere like that. What do we do with that?
Yeah, I think with law, the first thing you realize, I guess, depending on the year of study, if you're a first year student, it might be the sort of first time where you're getting, feedback on a law assessment at university or undergraduate level. If you're in second year, perhaps you've received a little bit more. You're getting used to what it is that your tutor or your lecturer is looking for in your written assessment. So I would say the starting point is realizing that you are writing a law assessment, And there are different forms of law assessments, I would say. So it could be an essay question, it could be a problem-based scenario question, or it could even be a presentation. Um, so you're preparing the slides and things like that. So the legal writing. So I would say the starting point is just being aware that you are writing a law assessment and it's slightly going to be different, or perhaps it's almost entirely different from what you may have been used to writing. So it's just that awareness that a law assessment requires different sets of skills, perhaps, for you to say that this is a good legal writing, or for you to be aware of in order to improve your legal writing. So first things first, keep in mind it is a law assessment. And then I would say the second thing that follows really closely from that is try to identify what type of law assessment is it. Is it an essay question you're trying to answer? Is it a problem question you're trying to answer? Or are you preparing presentation slides, for instance, or a poster? So having those sort of two first checklist, I think that that would be the sort of great steps towards, or the first steps towards learning how to incorporate feedback into your writing. And also, the feedback that you receive from your tutors would be slightly different. And that's purely because law is, to an extent, quite subjective, wouldn't you say? So it's not
Yeah.
a sort of science subject or math question where, 2 + 2 is 4, and that's sort of standard across board. With law assessment, we want to see that engagement, your interpretation, and not only your interpretation, how the judges have interpreted the law. We want to know the different opinions of the judges, because sometimes they do have different opinions. Then you've got academics, those who go on to write articles about it, so with the analysis. So it's a very rich discipline. So um, you do need, or there is that element of subjectivity, and perhaps we want to see that reflected in the way that you write, but at an objective standard. So it's not just you carrying on saying anything is possible. We want to see your authority, why something is the way it is, or as an explanation for the sort of point of view that you have. So it is still objective to the extent that you've got to refer to authorities, but it's subjective in the way that you write, or the angle or perspective with which you approach answering the question. So the reason I say this is that it means that the feedback you'd get based on the subject, or based on the style or type of assessment, if it's an essay question or a problem-based question, might be different. So perhaps for us, we could start by looking at, say, common things that might, I would say, you would find in, the different types of law assessments. And one key thing that sort of goes across the various types of assessment, I would say, is your ability to identify the legal issues. So if you have an essay question, it might be a quote from a case or from an article, and you might be invited to analyze or sort of critique that statement, or to say whether you agree with it or disagree with it. But you've got a question that you've got to engage with. You need to be able to identify the legal issues that are raised by that quote or by that case that you're going to talk about if it's an essay question. If it's a problem-based scenario, you're given a set of facts. And going through those facts, again, you'd be looking to identify what the key issues are in that scenario that you'd be dealing with. So I would say identifying what the legal issues are, that's a common area where you might get feedback from. So if you're able to identify the legal issues, then you can discuss on it, or explain it or try to analyze what those legal issues are. But if you're unable to do that, your feedback you'd receive from your tutor would point you towards that direction. Perhaps you've gone off topic, you haven't identified certain key things that should have been discussed, and that would be something that could affect the grades that you get. So if you receive feedback relating to identification of issues or having gaps in the law or going off point, that's something that you'd want to um, focus on in the future to say, I need to be able
Mm.
to identify these legal issues, because I think that would be the sort of crux of the sort of grade that you get in the end.
That's very good. That's very good.
Yeah.
I think identifying the issues, if you go off grid from, it being so important that if you identify it as something else, then obviously your analysis will be something totally different from what was expected in the first place. So the feedback
Exactly.
really is going to say you've not pinpointed the right issues here, therefore your analysis is cancelled out in the sense you're losing a lot of uh, points that you could have otherwise have done really well with, maybe
Mhm.
if you took a little bit more time to make sure that the issue that you've identified is the correct one. And then obviously you can always just check and question yourself before you start developing that analysis. That's very good. And what other pointers are there? Like when you're looking
Yeah.
at the feedback, what other pointers, like you were mentioning about the issues, would there be? And I like that you also said the fact that we are all different, so we might
Mhm.
all focus on different things when we're writing the feedback. Because although there is some sort of framework that we follow, sometimes we will write. It will be again a subjective thing because we're different, focus on different points, but really it's mainly the same sort of thing, isn't it?
Yeah, there's that sort of broad requirement of you've got to be able to, for instance, identify all the legal issues. That's something that would be the objective element of your script being or your
Mm,
answers being marked. And I'd say another thing to look out for would be, or a common theme would be the use of sources. So, and I think that's something that if you're in your first year, you might not yet get a hang of it. But by second, third year, we do expect you to be very comfortable referring to cases, to legislation in support of the points that you make. So at the sort of they're primary sources, but at the sort of minimal requirement is that you should, if you're writing a law essay, if you're answering a problem question or having a presentation and it's relating to law, you've got to have cases included in there. You've got to have legislation where it's applicable, referred to as well in support of your answer. So I think that that's feedback that sometimes particularly perhaps with problem questions, students tend to forget. So that's a sort of key area you should be looking out for in the feedback that you receive. Have they made comments to say where is your source or what cases can you use in support? So that's something that if you do get feedback in that area, it's something that you'd want to focus on. So for every time that you make a point, try to think, what case can I use in support? And you'd have to then incorporate or refer to the case or refer to the section of the law in how you answer the question. And and I think that that's just something with practice, you get used to it. And also, if you sort of pay attention to it when you're reviewing your work at the end, if you've written an essay or try to answer a problem question, just try look through it and say, could there be a case where I could include to sort of give it more support to this point, and that would mean you'd avoid your work being descriptive. So that's an area that I would say that if you're being assessed on, you might get feedback in terms of your use of case law or your use of or reference to relevant legislation.
Mm.
Yeah.
Wow, that's very good. And I
Yeah.
like how you went through all of the various sources as well, primary and secondary sources in that sense, because we like to see the resources. We like to see students understanding what they're using as well. And if they're
Mhm.
missing or if they're not quite adequate, or they're not using them enough because they're like, I always say, how much salt do you put salt at various stages in the cooking process? And
True.
you like a little bit of salt to begin with, then you can put salt on the meat, and then you can put salt in the water or for the veggies, and all of this cooking process. This salt would be the referencing, and you just have to, an abundance of it all over the place, and it's like
Yeah.
the little crumbs of salt.
And I
We have to
think,
see that.
yeah, with law, we can say we do like salty food in that regard. So lots of salt.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think when I say refer to cases, that's the sort of basic requirement. With legal writing, your analysis is always usually the next step. So when I
Mm,
say refer to cases, it's not enough that you just put Donahue and Stevenson, this was, or you put that in bracket and say, yes, I've put in a case or I've referred to a
mm,
particular legislation. It's not enough that you do that. And I think with analysis, a lot of students that come to me to discuss feedback, they're not always very clear what it involves when they say, oh, you haven't analyzed the law. And what I would say is,
okay.
if use of sources is about referring to cases or legislation, your analysis would then be things like referring to the reason for the decision. So if you do read a case that says, oh, yes, you've got to prove these three criteria in order to, satisfy the requirements for liability, and this is very broadly speaking, then there might be reasons why the courts came to that conclusion. Or previously, in a previous case, the reasons or the criteria perhaps may have been different. Which one do you think, or why did the law have to change? Was there any reason the judges gave as to this is why we've sort of decided the case this way? Or you can then look at articles which are secondary legislation where academics have provided comments as to why the law is changing or why the current law, the decision was flawed or why it's going to cause some uncertainty or things it's not very clear because based on the facts the law keeps changing or the decisions of the courts keep changing. So that's where your analysis comes in. So you're just going beyond mentioning the case. And I think, and if it were a and that would normally happen if that was an essay question where you could sort of engage with that discussion. With a problem-based question, perhaps you might be required to be a little bit more straightforward, and that would go then to your application of the law
Mm.
to the fact. So it's not enough to say this is the position of the law. Your feedback might be that you haven't applied the law to the facts of the scenario. So that
It's
would be
very
where we would need that
difficult.
analysis.
Yeah,
Yeah.
this one is a head scratcher really for many
Hmm.
students. The application, I think so often they forget about it, or it is just overlooked because of the process of ticking the boxes that are more important, that they think are more important. But
Hmm.
I mean, application, application,
Yeah.
application, right?
Application. And I think sometimes when you're marking, you do see that with people that, oh, they do know the law, they've stated the relevant legislation, but they've just left it at that. And I'm like, no, I don't know if you have the knowledge to say this is the advice or this would be the likely outcome, or perhaps there's certain facts that might mean that case would not apply, or there might be, something, and you need to see that sort of stated. And if you
Mm.
haven't done that sort of further analysis or try to apply the law to the set of facts to say, yes, this falls into um, the category being referred to in legislation, or based on these facts, it would be difficult to reconcile both, or it would be difficult to find the person liable. Those sort of engagement, but you would need that. And I think if you do get that sort of feedback, that's something that you should keep an eye on. Some students are very good with the application, but without reference to the law. So they just say what's going to happen. You know that they know the law to be saying that, but they just haven't referred to the law. While other students would refer to the law, but then would leave it at that without actually going further to analyze or to apply the law. So I'd say those are some sort of things you've got to look out for in your feedback and try to incorporate it into your writing.
So for students, to make it as simple as possible, I suppose, or just give it a snippet of what we said so far, we're
Mm-hmm.
looking at the steps, aren't we, really?
Mm-hmm.
In Because we're talking about feedback, but really what we're talking about is what you should be putting in your
Legal
work, so you
writing.
get the best possible feedback that you can work with and you can improve on, and make a big jump, from not getting not very good feedback to getting better feedback and more constructive feedback and so forth, based on a progression that you're making when
Mm-hmm.
you are incorporating feedback. So you're talking about these steps really,
Yeah.
in fact, when you're saying identify the issue, yeah,
Yes.
you're saying, um, when you're looking at it, it's not just using case law willy-nilly. You have to be specific about the case law, legislation, whatever the case may be, secondary, primary legislation, primary sources that you're using. And then it's not enough to just say, what the decision was, or the principle of the case, or the whatever the case may be, the legislation is, but you apply this to your case, to your scenario, to your issue, to your, I don't know, let's say it's an essay question, to your quote. Maybe you've got a quote in the essay question
Mm-hmm.
that was said. You have to go back to it and apply it. So, how would that look? How would a good application look? So that when you get the feedback, you're not really getting the feedback. You have not applied the, to the, you've not applied it to the problem question or your issue, your essay.
Yeah, and I think that that can be something that hopefully with time, um, in your seminars, I would say seminars are a good time because feedback is not only at the point of assessments when you submit at the end of the work.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes it's useful, but with block teaching, it might only be useful for the next module, which might have a different form of assessment. So I would say take your seminars really, in terms of sort of practical things to do, the seminars that you go to, take that really seriously, like actually engage in the activities, and you might get some sort of oral feedback from your tutor. And part of it is if you're attempting a problem-based scenario, um, in the seminars, the feedback might be that, oh, your analysis is weak, or you haven't applied the law to the facts of the case. And all I would say is if you state what the law is, and then you state what the principle, so you state the case or the relevant legislation, section 1 of the Trustee Act, or whatever legislation you're referring to, or the case that you're referring to. um the next step is to sort of say, this is the principle of the case, this is what it requires. So perhaps it requires that all agreements must be in writing. So that is, you're stating what the law is. And if it's a problem-based question, perhaps you may have been given facts that perhaps the agreement was not in writing, it was something that was orally communicated. So your application of that would say, from the scenario, we were told that a learner just orally communicated the terms of the agreement to Sophia, and there was no mention of it being in writing. So it's clear that it doesn't satisfy the Section 1 requirement that all agreements must be in writing, and as a result, the agreement is void. Elena would not be able to make a claim against Sophia. So
Damn.
that would be an example of um, applying the law to a set of facts. So you mentioned the relevant legislation, you say what the principle is or what the law says, that it's got to be in writing. Then you look at the facts. Has Elena, in fact, prepared that agreement in writing? She hasn't. What would be the outcome of that case?
Mm,
It might be with law slightly more complicated than it just being in writing. Perhaps it might say it's got to be evidence in some writing as opposed to just being in writing. So perhaps on the day the contract was created, maybe there was no written agreement, but there was some evidence down the line, a receipt was issued, a communication via email that might then
mm,
satisfy the other requirement of evidence in writing. Or there might be exceptions to the law that
mm,
say, it doesn't have to be in writing if so and so criteria is satisfied. So again, that would be an example of analysis. So knowing that it's
mm,
not just one rule fits all, there might be exceptions that apply, and then going further to sort of engage with that, then you could say, you know,
mm,
that would be some sort of practical way to make sure that you're analyzing or that you're applying the law to the facts. But common sort of feedback you would get would be referencing. So that would relate to your use of cases, but also because we use Oscola. And I know, Elena, you do a wonderful job uh, with that. But yeah, just to remind students that if you do get feedback relating to references, there is support at the
mm,
university in terms of the scholar referencing and how to improve on that. Your feedback could be you're not using enough case law, or it could be
mm.
something like it's very factual. You've only just factually
Yes.
analyzed the fact, or your work is quite descriptive. So you've just
Oh,
talked
can we
about,
spend a little bit of time on that too descriptive? Because yes,
yeah.
it's the same thing, isn't it? Factual
Mhm.
leaks into or leads to descriptive, doesn't it?
Yeah, so all you've done is just talk about the topic broadly without identifying those sort of key issues and focusing on it and trying to analyze or apply the law. So you've just left everything a bit sort of surface level, or your analysis is weak, or there's no application, or it could relate to your structure. And I
Mm,
think with structure, I always say there's usually no prescribed structure, but then again, if you've actually planned out your work, the chances are that it would reflect on your structure. If you know what you're talking about, if you know what the legal issues are, that would sort of help, your structure. That would lead to the clarity of the arguments that you make, or, the reader, whomever's marking your work, you just make it quite easy that you do know what you're talking about, and that this is the
mm,
position of the law, this is your analysis of the law. So I think structure is one area that students might get, a feedback on, to say that your structure was unclear or it was difficult to understand. The points that you were trying to make in your essay. So I would say that those are some key areas to sort of look out for.
I like that you went into structure as well because, I mean, it's important because very often various tutors for whatever module assessment, because obviously in every module you might have two, three assessments. Others might just have one for the block, but they will very often give you so much information. You'll get the brief, the assessment brief, but you are
Hmm.
also very often given a template, don't you? And I see
Yeah.
so many students forget to, actually interact with the template. It doesn't mean that you can't make it better or you can't adapt it, but that way you ensure that you're not forgetting anything, that you're
Hmm.
putting everything in there. So when you're given a bundle of information for the assessment, I would suggest making sure that you're looking at all of it, because I think very often the point on structure in terms of feedback are because the student hasn't paid attention
To the
to the
instruction.
brief, to the
Yeah.
structure that was suggested. Like,
Mm-hmm.
this is how you structure this particular assessment, because every assessment is a little bit different, isn't it? And
Yeah.
they're structured in that way, especially going through the blocks, because the idea of all of that is to improve on your skills and keep on improving for your second year, for your third year, and so forth. That's why they're built like that. So we're not. Like we were starting earlier when you were saying, not all assessments are the same. So
Mm-hmm.
what you're using in one, so you like the feedback in one assessment, it might be an advocacy exercise, an advocacy
Mm-hmm.
exam, but the next one might be a written one, so it's difficult. But always use the one, I would say use all of the feedback all of the time,
Yeah.
but you have to adapt it depending on what your next paper is. And then if you've got a written paper, then you look at the last feedback that you got in terms of your feedback on the similar sort of work. So if you
Yeah.
referencing was one of them, or make sure that referencing is, that much better this time around because you want to improve on that. That's
Yeah.
very good. Thank you for mentioning the structure. That's brilliant. Well, what about one last thing, Sophia? Because I mean, I think you can talk about this. I thought feedback would be very simple, straightforward thing,
Mm-hmm.
and it's not very much to go on. But actually, when we're saying writing an assessment is difficult, but understanding the feedback is also a job, isn't it? And
It
obviously
is.
using that to then take on, because you're on your own. Not many students want to approach their tutor to say, what does your feedback mean really? Because maybe the tutor will say, well, I said what it is, and sometimes it's really good for the student to approach the tutor, because we are there for you guys, and we want you to understand the feedback as well. So if something isn't clear, we always encourage them to just come and ask the question. It doesn't take anything. You could email. You don't even need to. We can have like a Teams meeting. Yeah. So be open to that. It's yeah, very good. You're open to work with us
Definitely.
for you to do better, because we want you to do better.
Yeah. And I think that that would just like, it's sort of last takeaway I want students to sort of take from this discussion is read the feedback. I think a lot of times students are just interested in the marks. Oh, I got a 2-1 or I got a first. That's all they care about. So I would say first things first, read the feedback and
Yes.
don't shy away like you said. Book an appointment with the tutor,
Mm,
so I'd just like you to sort of walk me through because that's how you improve. Sometimes you can read and say, oh, you haven't used a lot of cases, and in your head you're thinking, I've actually referred to all the cases that I know of. What else could I have done? So that's what that discussion would be about. And they could sort of go into details, give an example. And I think as a student, don't think that because the module is done, because now we've got block modules.
mm,
So by the
yeah.
time you get your grades back, perhaps you've started the second module and you're like, oh God, thank God I passed. I'm done with that, module and that's it. I would say still have that discussion because that's the only way you sort of improve. And even with
Yeah.
things that you've done well, sometimes you say, oh, this said I did, but what did I do differently? You're not really sure why, you're getting the high grades in this module and not in the other one. So I think
Mm,
just booking that appointment, it could be over Teams, it could be via email,
yeah.
coming to the office, whatever suits you. But I would say read your feedback and then speak to the tutor and
Mm,
plan. When you know all this, when you've got all this knowledge, you've listened to the podcast, you know what to do to include
mm,
cases, to analyze the law, to apply the law. You know you've got all of this. I would say plan because sometimes the people that write really good essays, it's not because they know everything. Sometimes it's just because they've allowed enough time for them to write the essay. So you might not be having good grades. It's not because you haven't got the relevant knowledge of that subject area. It just might be that you wrote your essay in 4 hours, or you're trying to answer the assessment, just to get it in by the deadline. So I would say allow enough time to plan your essay. Try to think of what the legal issues are. Am I including cases? Do I need someone to review my work? And I think the library, they could sort of read your essay to see if everything's coherent, logical, easy to read, those sort of things. So you can only use those services if you allow enough time
Mm.
before the deadline. So yeah, that read your feedback and don't shy away from meeting with your tutors.
Brilliant. I like that you said that. As the last thing, the fact that you said read your feedback. Actually, sometimes you will have a feedback comment in the comment box, won't you? But the rest of the paper also should be scanned because very often, depending on the tutor,
Mhm.
we're all different. We all have different approaches to marking that we prefer. Some of them will give you feedback on the actual
In
paper.
text,
So
yes.
just scan it in case you're getting presentation pointers or things like, punctuation or things like that that are also very valuable because one of the very important ones, I think very often you'll get is also proofreading because some students, like you say, you're writing it in a very short space of time, very close to the deadline. You've got no time for anyone to look at it. By the way, guys, I'm not talking about a colleague of yours that has the same sort of paper to write, okay? Because then you're bordering on plagiarism, or you're just giving them the opportunity to take
Yeah.
from your own work. We're talking about someone who understands English, who can read, so uh, give yourself
Yeah.
enough time, give
Yeah.
yourself enough time to do that because proofreading, just the way you're presenting it is
Important as
it's a
well.
reflection, yes, it's a
Yeah.
reflection of the effort you've made in submitting the paper. So that is very helpful. So look at all of the feedback in that sense, not just the comments box, in case they have written on the actual paper as well. Sophia, this has been amazing.
It has.
Thank you so much for being here and for volunteering to be with us. I do hope that students have taken a lot from it today because I think I
I
have
hope
learned
so.
a couple new things as well. How you have to think a bit of it like like a structured thing. So when you
Mm.
take on the feedback, when we were law students, we did the same, and the very often we'll just say, it's I passed, I did really well. Forget it, move on to the next. But actually, now being a tutor, a lecturer, we
You
appreciate
see the
things a little bit,
benefits. Yeah.
yes, in hindsight. So yeah, we're going to tell students in the hope that they'll think, oh
They'll
yes,
do
okay, so
better
I
than
am
we
going
did.
to
Yeah.
do better than we did. Exactly. Because you're just going to you're going to benefit from it no end, and I can promise you that. Sophia, thank you so much for
Thank
today. Thank
you.
you for your time, and thank you for the wonderful topic of how to incorporate feedback to improve the legal writing of our students in our assessments or anything else that you guys want to write if you want to do research or anything legal writing related. Okay, thank you for this and thank
All
you for
right.
watching, and we'll see you next time in a next or some other podcast. Maybe we'll see you, Sophia, in another
Bye
one
for now.
sometime.
Thank you.
Take
Thank
care,
you.
Sophia. Bye
Bye.
bye.
Bye.